recording? Hi everyone, I'm Thanassis, Cambanis, Director of Century International. Thank you all for coming in person, and thanks to our audience who will be watching this asynchronously later on YouTube. So thanks for tuning in, and thank you all for showing up. I'm so excited about this event. This culminates a year plus of really intensive communal research led by Peter Salisbury and a really fantastic team. And I'm just going to say a couple of words here at the top about the project and why it's so exciting, and then I'll give you a quick rundown of what we're going to be doing this morning so you have a roadmap of how we're going to be spending our time. So this project represents to me the sort of apotheosis of what we try and do as researchers, which is try and ask a hard question and without prejudice to what the answer is going to be, and use all methods at our disposal, qualitative and quantitative. And without spoiling what Peter's going to tell you about the findings, it really shows what open-minded researchers who think critically can do without the vast resources at their disposal that governments have. So we can find out things that intelligence agencies can't, not because we have satellites and huge amounts of intelligence at our disposal, but because we're willing to creatively use methods to answer questions and follow those answers when they take us to uncomfortable places. This project, more than anyone that I've worked on, has changed the way I understand the news that we're following right now with the war in Iran, but also more broadly, how I understand the way of modern war and modern economies. And as the morning unfolds, you'll understand, I think, why I'm so excited about this. So very quickly, we're going to have a presentation of the research findings from, so first we're going to have our sponsor, XCEPT, is going to come up for a minute and talk a little bit about XCEPT and why they funded and generously supported this project. Then Peter is going to come up, Peter Salisbury, and talk about the findings of the project. Nadwa Dawsari, one of the stalwarts of the research team, is going to present some of her findings. And then the three of us, me, Peter, and Nadwa, are going to have a rollicking roundtable where we look at the policy implications of this research and I think fight about some of the reasoning inside the project. Erica is going to respond to the discussion, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions and answers. That will conclude our formal presentation, which will end with sandwiches in the back. So hopefully you can stay for lunch. Once you've eaten your vegetables intellectually, you can have your food afterwards. I think with that, I will turn it over to Erica Gaston to tell us a little bit about XCEPT.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Erica Gaston. I work for a UN research institute called UNU Center for Policy Research, but I also am double-hatted, and I'm also a fellow with the XCEPT program. The XCEPT program is a research fund that's supported by the UK government, by FCDO, that has been running for about the last 5 years, funding a range of different types of research, all around the central question of trying to understand conflict in borderlands, how conflicts connect across borders, and how some of these broader ecosystems interact. This research is part of a series of research that the XCEPT program has been funding over the last year that seeks to understand how some of these dynamics fit into broader global economic trends and how this can relate to conflict embeddedness. I'm really excited to be joining here today. I'll offer a few thoughts after the initial discussion, connecting it to some of the other research that we've seen being funded in this stream, as well as potentially some of my own work. But just to thank you for joining today. I think this is a really, really important part of XCEPT's ongoing work. And I think you're going to be, having seen a preview of it, you're going to be fascinated, I know, by what Peter and Nadwa have to share. Thanks.
All right, good morning. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Before I start, I want to thank the Century Foundation and Century International for supporting and hosting this work for the past year. I want to thank XCEPT for funding and supporting it for the past 2 years. So this started as a study of smuggling networks in Yemen, And we were then funded to expand the lens, open the aperture of our work, and ask this question about how the axis of resistance, this network of Iran-backed actors across the Middle East and North Africa, functions. And what I'm going to do today is run you through this. The project started in 2024. We started with mapping these smuggling networks in Yemen, and very quickly we came to this place where we realized this group, the Houthis, who are supported by Iran, weren't just receiving weapons, they were building their own complex, globalized supply chains. And we started to think that they had reached a tipping point in terms of their internal capability. And XCEPT very kindly offered to fund us, and Century International and Century Foundation very kindly offered to host us to deepen that research. And we think that this work helps answer the very live question of how and why Iran and the axis of resistance proved so resilient in the face of far more powerful military adversaries since the events October 2023. And the answer is two transformations. One, in the inner workings of the axis of resistance and axis of resistance groups, and another transformation in the way that the global economy works, that people plug into that global economy, and the influence of Western states over the global economy. And we use drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, to tell that story, because they are both a really important part of the current conflict landscape globally, but they help us trace that progression. Can we move to the next slide? These are the two transformations. And what I'm going to try and convince you by the end of the day today, if you look on the left, at the very top left, you've got this picture, which is the axis of resistance, as many people imagine it. So it's like an old-fashioned telephone exchange. You have a single central hub, that's Iran, and then you have these different groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Qata'ib Hezbollah in Iraq, various Syrian groups that were supported by Iran. And the general view, the theory for a long time has been, all these groups are connected in a linear manner to Iran. They're entirely dependent on Iran. And if you, to use the colloquial phrase, cut the head off the octopus, then there is no more axis of resistance. And what I'm going to try and convince you today is that in fact the axis of resistance today looks much more like the thing in the bottom left, where some groups are hubs in and of themselves. They're able to cultivate new members of the axis of resistance. They're plugged into the global economy in ways that allows them to build their own arms, to run their own economies, and they're connected to one another. And really, again, if you take the telephone exchange metaphor in the top left, this is more like the internet, where everything is connected to everything else. And behind that transition, I'm going to argue, are shifts in the global economy, which is what's on the right, where we move from a highly Western-dominated global economy, where the main goods that you need to do pretty much anything, where the internet, international financial system, all route through Western channels, to the one in the bottom right, where you have an entirely new economic system and you have multiple ecosystems within the global economy nested within one another and connected to one another. Next slide. Drones help tell the story. I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone by saying that drones, UAVs, have changed the shape of modern warfare. And the symbol of that change is this drone very beautifully drawn by my colleague Henry Thompson, which is known as the Shahed 136, first used in large volumes by Russia in the war in Ukraine, and more recently used by Iran in its asymmetric war against the Gulf states and against Israel since this February. Drones represent a democratization of types of technology that were once the preserve of only really, really powerful states. And Iran has been both a prolific proliferator of drones, but also at one and the same time has honed a drone doctrine which is far in advance of many countries. And the proliferation is the story of that doctrine. By providing these drones to many, many groups and many, many states, Iran has been able to gather data on what does and does not work, and it has been able to refine its technique. Drones are also an isotope tracer. They're a way for us to look at what capabilities different groups are by tracking what drones they have and tracking the moment at which groups evolve from receiving drones to building themselves using components, raw materials they themselves import from global supply chains, from licit global supply chains. Next slide, please. So let's start first and take a step back. What is this change within the axis of resistance that I'm talking about? Next slide. For this project, we had a team of researchers looking at the history and evolution, particularly of the capabilities of different axis of resistance groups. And that meant going back in time and looking at how they came to be cultivated by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and how they came to become more and more capable. And this story is really a story of throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. It's a story of spreading bets. What we learned was that the IRGC, and latterly Hezbollah, has a long-standing history of trying to cultivate as many groups as is humanly possible. And when we think about the axis of resistance, when we think about these very powerful groups, they're just a very, very small minority among the number of groups that have been cultivated over time. But what has happened is that the IRGC first and latterly Hezbollah have developed a playbook, if you like, what we call the capability ladder, a way to upskill groups, assess them, and bring them up in terms of capability, but also bring them in terms of their dependence on Iran and the axis, creating interdependencies across the axis. And what we see is that different groups end up at different stages of the ladders. So at the very bottom there, you might be a little bit surprised to see Al-Shabaab, the Somali group, and I'll ask Nadwa to come back and explain why they're there at the bottom of the ladder today. Then, the next ladder up, you've got Fatimiyun, which is this Afghan Shia group that the Iranians cultivated, deployed into conflict in Syria, but did not train beyond basic military capability. Above that, we've got Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, who the IRGC really sort of trained up, upskilled, but then stopped at a certain point. Kataib Hezbollah have very advanced weapons. They have drones, they have missiles, they can use them at a very, very high level, but they've never been trained to operate them and build them autonomously. And at the very top of this scale, we have Hezbollah, of course, the group that really sort of climbed this ladder first, and we have the Houthis in Yemen. And the scary part of looking at the ladder is that a curricula has formed over time, where we start with basic training. When a group shows enough promise, but also shows enough identity, enough identification with the core aims of Iran and the Axis, they move up a step. They move up a step when they become more capable, when they take over territory, when they're able to build up their own weapons. And in 24 and 25, we saw the net effect of what this means when the Houthis started firing missiles and drones at Red Sea shipping and missiles at Israel and drones at Israel. That when you get to the top of this ladder, you move from being this very old-fashioned view of kind of guys, it's the classic Orientalist view of the Houthis, guys in flip-flops with AK-47s, running around, your classic guerrilla insurgents of the 21st century with this low-tech, low-cost technology, whereas what they represent is something which is much more like state power as we imagine it, and in fact, in terms of their military capabilities, the Houthis at a strategic level are more powerful than many states. Move to the next slide. And the way that we've been tracing this capability transfer is through drones. It's through UAVs. Iran has, as I said, been a proliferator of drones, and we created this very confusing Sankey chart where we tried to track all the different drones that Iran had been proliferating. The Iranians have one set of names, the different groups and states give these drones different names. So for example, the Shahed 136 is the Shahed 136, but then when it's in Russia, it's the Geran 2. When Hezbollah use it, it's a different name. When the Houthis use it, it's the Wired 2, so on and so forth. So what we did was we went through a very intensive purpose, and I'm always asked not to speak too much about methodology, so I won't do it right now, which is why you've got all these tiny font graphics, but you don't need to care about those, because what we were able to do is then distill that, next slide please, into this much simpler chart. And we're able to say that in fact, Iran primarily transfers 4 key types of drones to different groups, and those drones tell us a lot about the groups. And we can then sub-differentiate into groups that just receive them and groups that can build them themselves. And these are the groups we're most interested in, but we're also interested in that graduated process. And what we were also interested in was working out how can we represent how these groups are becoming more capable. And what we saw as we started studying that through the process of training, if we go to the next slide, was that the groups increasingly intersect and work not just with Iran directly via this telephone mechanism, but with one another. So I've skipped a slide, which is fantastic high level of professionalism. Let's just move on to the next slide, and I'll come back to the point there. What we did was we looked at UAV training. So we looked at open source descriptions of UAV drone training courses across the Middle East and North Africa from 2010 to present. And what we saw was at the very beginning of this process, all this training is happening in Iran, led by Iranian instructors. Over time, what we see is a shift. First, we see Hezbollah building its own internal training and manufacturing capability. Then we see Hezbollah instructors going to Syria and Iraq and instructing other people. Then we see this convergence, if we can move to the next slide, around Syria. So there's a period between 2017 and 2014 when the IRGC and Hezbollah collectively control a number of air bases where they are manufacturing and they're training different groups. And what we see during this period is the formation of a cohort. There are periods when Hamas, PIJ, Houthis, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, other Iraqi groups in what we now call the Islamic resistance in Iraq are all training together. And the connections, the connectivity between them doesn't end when the Assad regime falls. So we end up with two things coming out of this period and this process. One, we can see these groups going from Hezbollah into 2004, 2005 has 3 Iranian drones. One of them crashes, one of them is spotted by the Israelis, and one of them has a mechanical failure, and they can't run it till an engineer comes from Tehran. We fast forward 20 years, Hezbollah instructors are teaching Russian pilots how to use Shahed 136s in Syria in 2024. They're building these things en masse, and they're moving around the region. We have Houthi instructors and Houthi experts working with Iraqi groups to test advanced drones. And as Nabwa will describe in a little bit, more recently, we see the Houthis training Al-Shabaab on the use of basic surveillance drones and probably how to manufacture one of the more basic versions of these drones with Sudanese Islamist groups. So this is a fundamental change in the inner workings of the groups themselves and of the Axis itself. Now let's go back just 2 slides, backwards, sorry. The other thing that we start noticing is that the inner workings of the Axis groups change as they progress up this ladder. There's a fundamental difference between receiving 2 or 3 UAVs from Iran and having your own globalized supply chains via which you import lots of different parts. It changes 2 things. One is the scale at which you can operate. So one of the case studies that we follow in the report is a guy called Fadel Zahri, who in 2024 was caught running an operation largely by himself, fraudulently obtaining people's IDs, importing hundreds and thousands of drone parts to Europe, and then shipping them to Lebanon. And he was caught trying to ship around 2,000 UAV engines to Lebanon. Hezbollah's entire pre-2023 drone fleet was estimated at 2023 drones. So when you get to this point where you have the internal capability to run your own procurement supply chains, you can work at a colossally larger scale than trying to smuggle individual drones to someone else. But you've also built something that is quite organic, quite messy, but is equivalent to state capacity, institutional capacity. You've got engineers, you've got operators, you've got supply chain operators, you've got businessmen, you've got people working on the finance side. This is something fundamentally different than an insurgent group that relies on one arms broker or relies on one state patron. And when we put all these dots up together, we can go 3 slides ahead. At least I know where my slides are. This is where we come to this picture, where we have moved from a network which is a very simple linear thing, this central hub that everything runs through, to an ecosystem where these groups connect to one another, they connect to global supply chains, and they have their own internal capability, and they increasingly act as hubs. This is something much more like the internet, as I said, than it is that old-fashioned telephone exchange. And that fundamentally changes the inner resilience of the axis. And I think we can see this through some of what's happened in the past few years. In 2024 into 2025, senior Hezbollah leadership was killed, including some of their top drone people. And yet, by the time we got to February 2026, Hezbollah had reconstituted not just its ability to manufacture, not just its knowledge of drones, but its supply chains, as I'll talk about in a moment. At one and the same time, senior Houthi missile and drone commanders all killed in 2025, and again, reconstituted themselves, were able to continue firing those missiles and drones. And if you think about this on the right as the internet, we've had this critical node theory in the way that we think about Iran and the Axis and similar groups for a long time. If we kill the right people, if we take out the right capabilities, then everything will go away. But the internet does not work like that. You lose one computer, one modem, and it reconstitutes itself around it. That is a pool of knowledge on how to build these drones, operate them, and you can reconstitute much more quickly, both in terms of your knowledge base and your operational capabilities, and as I'll try and show you, in terms of your supply chains. Let's move 2 slides forward, I think. And that brings me to this question of global shifts. I was talking about scale a moment ago. In 2009, German authorities caught a cell of Iranian businessmen who were trying to smuggle around 60 drone engines to Iran, claiming that they were jet skis. You fast forward to 2026, so about 17 years later, a copy of that exact same engine was used to fuel the Russian Garan 2/1 drone campaign in Ukraine, and to fuel the Iranian campaign in the Gulf. And what had changed was the location of manufacturing and manufacturing capability. So in 2009, most of the intermediate goods you need to build advanced, semi-advanced weapons lived in the West. If you wanted a really good drone engine, if you wanted the tools you needed to make the fuselage for a drone, so on and so forth, if you wanted the guidance system for a drone, you had to go to the United States or Germany. I'm British, so I'll claim the UK, probably not entirely true, but a couple of British engines in there for good measure. China has become the world's largest producer of intermediate goods. And what we saw was that those engines that were being imported to Iran were first duplicated by a local manufacturer who then appears to have sold the designs on to Chinese manufacturers who were able to increase the scale and the quality iteratively as they themselves innovated, to the point where we then saw Chinese origin engines going into these drones. What does this mean from in the context of the Axis? It means that the choke point in supply moved from the West, where sanctions can really be more easily applied, to the East. And it also meant that things moving to the Middle East in particular no longer had to move through trade corridors controlled by the United States, by European powers, but instead moved through what we would call the global South. And that's really, again, what this visual on the right, you don't have to worry too much about the very tiny text, is showing us. On the left, we have a world of the early 2000s, where the bits in blue and red are North America and Europe, and the one sort of larger node in the global economy is Japan. You move down to the bottom, and you have China, a larger export economy than the United States, surrounded by this constellation of Asian and quote-unquote global South actors, many of whom are re-exporters. So goods are being exported to Turkey, to Singapore, to the UAE, to Vietnam, and then re-exported to other countries. So they're moving through these different channels, and we have the explosion in what we could call legal services that gives us things like shell companies. Can we move to the next slide? The way that we tell the story about this in the report is these engines. And what this figure shows us is again, the key drones that I described earlier that Iran has proliferated over the last 20 odd years, when you start going up to about sort of 2015, all those drones use European or US made engines in blue. When you get to that kind of mid 2015 to 2020 point, we start seeing Iranian made duplicates coming into play, and then we see Chinese made duplicates at much larger scale and increasingly high quality, and then Chinese origin engines going into them. If we can go to the next slide. And the way that we illustrate this in the report, and that we illustrated this in an earlier report via Century that came out this February, is we look at the Houthis in Yemen. And again, the beginning of the Yemen war, so around 2015, exactly at that kind of turning point that I'm describing, the Houthis are receiving 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 drones that are being shipped from Iran. Fast forward to what was happening in 24, 25, when they're hitting all these ships in the Red Sea with drones and missiles. What we see in that, what we describe in that report, is how interdictions by local and international forces of material going to the Houthi goes through this shift in pretty much the timing that I describe, where around 2020, 21, they stop receiving entire pieces of kit directly from Iran, and they themselves start importing the goods that go into the weapons in the first place. So they're importing and they're building up supply chains. So things aren't just coming through one channel. They're going to multiple transit hubs, be it UAE, Turkey, Djibouti, sometimes to Somalia. They're being brought in through cargo shipping. They're being brought in through dhows. And I can tell you, and you can read that report as well, that just massively increases the level of difficulty of trying to get this stuff to a group like the Houthis, and again means that they can start building weapons at a colossally larger scale compared to where they were at the beginning of the war. If we can go to the next slide. And we give this example in the report of the Ababil T, which is that drone that Hezbollah had about 3 or 4 of in the early 2000s. The Houthis started using it around 2016 or 2017. Because we've spent a lot of time looking at these things, we've been able to build up this great database. You saw sort of the macro data of interdictions coming into Yemen. And if we can go forward one slide, we had some great people on the team. And again, this is sort of the work of a very large team, including 2 former members of the UN panel of experts who were able to take the drone apart, if you like, and work out what goes into it. And if we go to the next slide, we then attach the interdiction data to it, and we can start looking at what's actually going into it and where it's coming from. So again, beginning of the war, these drones are being transferred pretty much intact to Yemen for use by the Houthis. By the time we get to 25, 26, 60% of the raw material and components that go into it are manufactured in China. About 15% come from Europe and the United States, but are being sent to these intermediary hubs, then on to Yemen. 15% come from Iran, and they're all items that if the Houthis so chose, they could import from China or somewhere else anyway. So there's a transformation in the groups, but also the global economy, their ability to build these things at scale and move them in a way that is much, much harder to stop than before. If we can go to the next slide. And then when we start building out this picture, what we see is that the global infrastructure moving these things and the technology that allow people to conceal the movement of these goods is also advancing in a way that is not in the favor of actors who are trying to stop them. So if we can move forward one slide. That's a picture of Yemen's, or Houthi-controlled ports, connectivity to other ports worldwide. And what you can see is Yemen is very, very disconnected from the rest of the world. That's pretty much all the trade that goes into Houthi-controlled areas. But if you look in there, the UAE and Djibouti are both connected to Yemen. And if we move to the next slide, that's Djibouti's connectivity to the world. So if the Houthis can, as they do, get goods to the UAE or Djibouti from anywhere in the world, it is relatively easy to move them into Yemen if they can conceal the movement of those goods. And they're getting much better at moving those goods and concealing them. If we can move to the next slide. Here we see sanctions on UAV facilitating entities worldwide. And we see that there are 2 countries that stand out beyond Iran, facilitating the movement of components to different access groups and to Iran. And those are Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. So again, these bridge jurisdictions, super important to the movement of goods, but both of those countries not really actually sort of super sanction sensitive, you might want to call it. Not countries that are actually really great at enforcing Western sanctions. So again, the choke point for supply has moved. Things are moving through these increasingly complex supply chains and via jurisdictions that are much harder for the West to influence. If we can move on to the next slide. And when you need the really high-tech stuff, other advances in technology are helping out as well. So this is a mapping using something called AIS, which is kind of like a reverse GPS, where a ship sends a signal and says where it is, of a ship that we observed this past February. The ship moved up towards the Strait of Hormuz and switched off its AIS, switched off its identifier for about a month. It was spotted on satellite imagery at a place called Shahid Raja'i port in Iran. It then reappeared around the 28th of February, pretty popular date, made its way to a spot just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, where it gave the impression that it had docked but did not enter the port. It went to Djibouti, where it apparently cleared UN verification inspection, and then it went on to Yemen. And that's one of around 10 ships, all linked to the same corporate network that we've seen doing the same thing over the last 5 or 6 years, going into that particular port, Rajai, which is pretty well known as an entrepot for Iran's smuggling program, arms program, and where the ships then move on to Syria and Yemen. I cannot say definitively what they are moving, but there's a fairly clear indication that they are evading international monitoring mechanisms in a pretty smart way. And if we can move on to the next slide. And what we see is that those ships are then clustered around these really complex ownership structures, where you've got all these companies registered in places like Panama and Turkey, where it's very hard to know who owns them. But what we did find is that a number of those ships have a link to a shipping manager that it turns out is linked to some ships that have been sanctioned for moving Iranian oil, and are in turn linked to another Syrian-owned shipping firm which has been sanctioned, both whose owners have been sanctioned for shipping Iranian oil and for moving money for Hezbollah and other actors. But again, the complexity of breaking this down, of working out those connections, of seeing where the ships are going is just much, much higher than it was 20 years or so ago. So you can move these commercially available components via these various different destinations, and if you have to get something in from Iran, much easier to obscure the location of a ship, who owns the ship. And in fact, what we discovered later on in the research process was that this entire commercial fleet that you see kind of up there in the top row had a completely different set of names and corporate owners, but were linked to the Syrian magnate who runs the oil shipping firm until he got sanctioned, renamed, rebadged, and incredibly hard to trace. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the axis of resistance? Why am I telling you all this boring stuff about shell companies and shadow fleets? Well, again, think back to that story I was telling you about the axis itself and how it moves from this simple linear network to this ecosystem. This is our mapping of the main smuggling routes from Iran to its allies in the region around 2000 to 2006. Let's move to the next slide. This is it up to about 2012. It gets a little bit complicated, more complicated. Sudan comes into play, so you can move things up to Hamas. Things move directly from Iran to Hezbollah. The Houthis are probably coming into play around this time. Let's move to the next slide. This is us up to about 2019. Commercial shipping is coming into play. Things are coming in from Europe. We're seeing a land route open up between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And the story about a year and a half ago was, well, the Assad regime has fallen. The Syria land corridor is lost. Hezbollah will not be able to resupply. If we can go to the next slide. But again, when we start mapping out what the supply chain for the axis writ large of today looks like, it looks like this. It looks, again, like a complex adaptive ecosystem where lots of things are moving in lots of different directions at any moment. And much like a just-in-time supply chain system, as we saw during COVID, they work it out pretty quickly. They get you your Amazon package pretty quickly. And if you think about this as the Amazon of the axis of resistance, what we see is that this is also, along with the global economy, gone through these two shifts where it has become much more complex, much more distributed, much more able to adapt to interdiction, to bombing, so on and so forth, and plugged into this part of the economy that is increasingly outside of the reach of sanctions, which has been the primary tool for stopping these actors. If we can go to the next slide. I said I'd do this in 25 minutes. I have overrun. Anyone who knows me is unsurprised. I'm going to talk really quickly about sort of, if we can move to the next slide. I'm not going to get into network theory or biological theory or any of these points, but when ecosystems reach a certain size, they do not stop at the boundaries that we impose on them. And we also have this mental image of Iran, the axis of resistance, living in a certain geographical space and functioning only within certain degrees of ideological actors. And we have this mental image that this is about Iran, one by one, picking people up and lifting them up. But as we've seen in the case of the Houthis, who were in fact cultivated and trained initially by Hezbollah, once groups get to a certain point, they can create this hub space for themselves and expand the axis in ways that we don't perhaps anticipate. And now I'm going to hand over to Nadwa, and she's going to preview some research that we will publish in fall, but that we talk about in the Beyond the Axis report on the Houthis in Africa. Next slide, please.
Is this okay? All right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for the Century Foundation. It's been really great being part of this project with you, and thank you all for coming today. So I was asked to talk about the Houthis in Africa, and it's been my obsession for a few years now. The Houthis have been building or expanding into the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, focusing on recruitment, smuggling, but more importantly, strategic partnership. And they've been trying to establish a foot in that region. So in terms of smuggling, the Houthis' smuggling networks, their smuggling networks, not their own, they control. They're now in Somalia, they're in Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and also Sudan. But beyond smuggling, the Houthis have been focused on two important things, recruitment and group cultivation. So at home in Yemen, Yemen has a large African diaspora and refugees from all over the Horn of Africa. So what the Houthis have been doing over the past 10 years is systematically recruiting from among these communities, mostly younger people, children and younger people. They take them, they put them through rigorous training away from their families, indoctrination, military training, and then they vet them. So some of them end up in the front lines in Yemen, others end up smuggling drugs into Saudi Arabia, but then the third and most important category, they are sent back to their home countries as intelligence assets working for the Houthis. That's in Yemen, but outside Yemen as well, the Houthis have been targeting cross-border communities in the Horn of Africa, looking at marginalized communities with a history of insurgency. I was able to verify a case of the Afar tribe, and this is the tribe that stretches between Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. The Houthis have managed to cultivate assets there. They've brought them to Yemen, they train them, and then some of them went back to their home country. You will see more details about this case in the upcoming report, so I'm not going to ruin it for you. They also recruit, so the communities they focus on are also in Somalia and also in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, and Sudan and Eritrea. The other part also, the Houthis are building these strategic partnerships with groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and reports have been coming out about that recently. So part of that is smuggling, but part of it is more important than smuggling. So the collaboration with between the Houthis and Shabaab is, in my opinion, quite advanced at this point. Hundreds of Al-Shabaab members have come to, or operatives, leaders have come to Yemen where they've received training in military training, and also training in, we're talking about drones, drone maintenance and drone use, and probably manufacturing, I don't know at this stage. But also the Houthis have now established presence, operational presence in Somalia, in coordination with Al-Shabaab. Both groups have discussed joining forces against the US and the West and their allies in the region, but also they've discussed a collaboration in maritime attacks. So this relationship is evolving, the reports are coming out, and we're only scratching, we've only scratched the surface at this point. So behind all of this, Houthis in Africa operations, there is a small cell in Sana'a that manages all this expansion. And this small cell is led by a guy called Abdul Wahid Abu Ras. Abdul Wahid Abu Ras is a Houthi. He's an ideologue. He was with the Houthis since he was a small child. The guy was the key liaison between the IRGC and the Houthis when the Houthis was fighting the government in the mid-2000s until 2010. He is the Houthis' deputy minister of foreign affairs / acting minister of foreign affairs now. So I'll leave it here, and then we're happy to talk more in the discussion.
Sorry. Can we move 2 slides? Yeah, let's move to here. Why do we care about the Houthis moving into Africa, given this story that I've told you? If we think in ecosystems, and we think about that capability ladder that I showed you, Shabab are somewhere between cultivation, they're moving into basic training. And that's a way of drawing them in to the axis, little by little, which is surprising, right? Because your expectation is that a Sunni group like Al-Shabaab will not want to work with the Houthis. But what we've seen across the axis in this relatively limited number of cases of groups that climb the ladder is they become more strategically capable over time, and they become drawn into interdependence. So Hamas in the 2010s had a falling out with Iran over Syria, tried to pull away. Who stepped into the breach to help Hamas out? Absolutely nobody. These are groups that are generally marginalized or excluded in their own communities, excluded internationally, and it creates this sort of two-way need. Iran gets all this data, thinking back to the drone program, back from these groups. It has its doctrine of forward defense. It has the Houthis bombing things in the Red Sea, and it's in constant expansion. So even as people, the narrative was, the axis is done, it's contracting, Hezbollah is done, they've lost Syria. What we see through this research is the axis is also expanding little by little into Africa. Those bets in Africa won't all play off. We're not trying to be super alarmist and say that the Houthis in Iran are going to take over the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. But what we are saying is that in the cases where these bets have paid off in different ways, in the case of Fatima Yun, Afghanistan, they've been auxiliaries in wars that Iran and others have led. In the case of Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, they've become a powerful actor with access to powerful weapons. And in the case of the Houthis and Hezbollah, at the top of that capability ladder, they've become strategic actors with state-like powers. And they've created a context in which conflict is perpetuated. So when we think about it as an ecosystem, I think we move towards a slightly different story about why we might be concerned about this. But the challenge from a policy perspective, when we come and describe this to American, British, European policymakers, is this question of what's the way in? How do we do this? This is too complicated, and basically people have 3 or 4 tools, which are the tools of critical nodes. How do we sanction people? How do we kill people? And how do we apply political pressure? Well, what have we seen over the past several months? The culmination of that strategy, the most extreme form. We've had maximum pressure on Iran economically. We've had this colossal bombing program. We've had the decimation of Gaza. We've had these incredibly powerful attacks on Hezbollah and Lebanon. And I think what our research shows is not to say that these groups have not been damaged, disrupted, or deteriorated in some ways, but that when we think about it ecosystemically, it's still growing and morphing into a new shape. and could potentially outlast Iran, outlast the Islamic Republic if it were to collapse, because of these capabilities seeded across the ecosystem and that pool of knowledge across the ecosystem and that global economy with all these intermediate goods which are getting better and better, and people can attach to things like computers attached to AI. So it's a frightening thought in terms of the global conflict landscape and the policy tools that we have available in. What we say is that through this sort of using drones as an isotope tracer, we found a little bit of a way in to start flushing out the system, seeing how far it spreads, and work out where people live on the capability ladder. If we can go to the next slide. There's the next slide again. And what we argue in the report is two things, effectively. First is that you have to tier your policy response. For groups, the very limited number of groups who've reached that threshold and crossed the capability tipping point, you really have a limited number of tools unless you want to expend enormous amounts of resource. And don't forget that the United States went toe-to-toe with the Houthis in the Red Sea in 2025 and essentially decided to broker a truce because they were so worried about the amount of resource they would have to expend in order to actually defeat them militarily. That's the story of what happens when you reach this tipping point. Groups before the tipping point are more amenable and more susceptible to policy outreach. But the question then becomes, what are we doing here? Are we trying to reach out to these groups? Are we trying in the context of Africa to foster better governance environments, more inclusivity for these groups? Or are we continuing to take this militarized approach that appears not to have worked very well over the course of decades? And I do think that it's possible to peel groups away. There's a great example here in Iraq with the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which I always get wrong, where a lot of these groups are effectively cultivated, trained in Iran, by Iran, over the course of decades, but when they're given a stake in Iraq's political future, they actually start moving away to an extent from Iran. Not outside of Iranian influence, but they're trying to do their own thing autonomously within their country. When people have a stake in their own context, there is something that you can do. The militarized approach doesn't always work, and Nabwa and I in our conversation with Thanassis will discuss whether or not that is correct. And with these groups over the tipping point, a much more complex situation. Do you break bread with them, or do you try and foster counterbalancing ecosystems and networks? Some actors in the regions have been trying this. The example that people often give to us is the United Arab Emirates. That has its own costs, and these groups can spiral out of groups' control. It's not a very happy set of thoughts in terms of where our policy options are, but I do think it's a more realistic set of thoughts about what the opportunities are for policy interventions, but also this very frightening thought that we can see more and more of these ecosystemic actors linking up different conflicts. So if the Houthis are in Sudan, in Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and there is a broader possibility of a region-wide conflict, which I think is a very real risk in the Red Sea in particular, given increasing linkages between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudanese conflicts. And then you bring the Houthis in and this ecosystemic approach, this capability ladder, which really sort of, this cultivation approach, which works better in a context where there is conflict. It's really, really worrying to think about where conflict is going and where we are as policymakers, and we need to start thinking. Our argument is in ecosystems. I thank you so much for listening to me for such a long time. I apologize for overrunning. I look forward to the conversation with Thanassis and Nabwa.